I'm chatting to Mark Byrne from the Total Environment Centre, who has received a grant from Energy Consumers Australia to work on decarbonisation and the NEM, but a really interesting strand of work is that around energy system resilience and what that means for the energy sector. So Mark, first of all, what is energy system resilience and why was this a priority area for the work that you're undertaking?
Resilience is something that needs to be differentiated, first of all, from reliability. Reliability is kind of like a narrow outcome of resilience, but a resilient system is one that, depending on the definition, either bounces back to its original state after a shock or adapts to a new reality. In terms of why I'm focusing on it as a priority, I've been reading and then thinking and then writing and finally speaking about climate change since about 1990. And I've been increasingly concerned that while there's been a big focus on decarbonising the energy system, which is obviously a necessary thing, it's only part of the equation. That's the mitigation side of the equation, but there's also adaptation, how we adapt to a new reality. After Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico in 2017, which kind of wiped out the electricity grid, and the local authorities started to think about whether local microgrids might be a better way to go instead of just rebuilding the transmission system. And there are a couple of local events around that time. Just before that was the South Australian Black System event caused by a tornado. And since then, we've had the horrendous bushfires last spring and summer, both of which have made us look more closely at what we need to do to make the system more resilient in relation to climate change impacts in particular.
So jurisdictions have been focusing on energy system reliability. How does the concept of resilience make us think about the overall interests of consumers a little bit differently?
There's a particular problem with the way reliability is defined in the regulatory framework, in that it's focused on short-term localised outages of up to 12 hours. And if it's a longer-term outage or if it's a widespread outage, then that's just not covered by the rules. And these kind of longer-term and more widespread outages are becoming more common. But in terms of how it affects people on a day-to-day basis, to give you a practical example, if you're living in an isolated coastal town, say, that's at the end of a long feeder that's got a lot of forested areas around it, so there's a high bushfire risk. If that line goes down to a bushfire every, say, 20 years, then the network would probably think, okay, well, that's just the way it is, and we'll replace that line when it goes down, hopefully as quickly as possible. But if the bushfire risk is going to double over the next 20 years, then it changes the economic equation. And both the network and the local community might want to think about alternatives to rebuilding the line, like a local microgrid or individual power systems if it involves smaller numbers of properties. Or it might be something like offering rebates to residents to have islandable solar and battery systems, so that when the main grid goes down, at least for a day or so, they might have their own backup supplies.
So what does a more resilient system look like, and how do we get there?
I think there's probably a few elements to it. The first thing we need is the right mix of kind of bulk scale, or the big stuff coming through the poles and wires that's going to stay there when you get a localized outage. So you've got to have that. But we also increasingly are recognizing the importance of distributed or local resources like standalone power systems and microgrids, and demand response, energy efficiency, things that reduce the amount of energy we need in the first place. And then in some cases, going off grid as well, where that's economically feasible. So we need the right mix of resources, and we haven't really thought too much about what is the right mix of resources, large, small, and off grid. We also need some kind of risk assessment framework that enables both networks and communities to think about what is going to be the increase in climate risk in the future, and how does that change our decisions about what to invest in and what's the best kind of mix of resources for us in our local situation. And finally, we need the right regulatory framework that incentivises the industry and also communities and individual customers to kind of think about what's going to make a more resilient system. So that's the last piece of the puzzle, is the one that we're focused on in particular.
So maybe just quickly summarise the work that you've undertaken in this area, and maybe just talk about how you hope that this work will have an influence on rule changes and regulatory processes and the way decisions are made in the energy sector in Australia.
So what we're particularly focused on is presenting a rule change request with the Central Victoria Greenhouse Alliance to the AEMC early next year, which would require networks to consider resilience alongside reliability and security when they're doing their investment planning every 5 years as part of their revenue proposal. So that would also require the regulator, the AER, to develop a guideline which would help the networks to implement the risk assessment framework that is being undertaken at the moment as part of the electricity sector climate information, or ESCI, project that I'm also a part of.
So the system resilience work and the focus on it is, in a way, an emerging way of thinking in the energy sector. Based upon the work you've already done, what signs are we seeing from other organisations and bodies that are building upon this new thinking and undertaking their own projects and pushing these ideas forward?
I think the take-up of the work that I started with CutlerMerz on cost-benefit analysis of increasing resilience in bushfire-prone areas has been a positive sign, and they've developed a lot of IP that will be, I think, quite useful to other parties in the future. And I keep banging on about it in the media, and I hope that that's been helpful as well. Amongst the market bodies, I think there's a growing awareness, but there's not a lot of sophistication in their thinking as yet. There's a lot of references to resilience, but there's not a clear understanding of what it is and what it requires in terms of regulatory reform. So we've got a way to go there, but through the rule change consultation process over the next year, I think that will happen with the AEMC's help.
Mark, I've heard you speak about this topic before at various presentations associated with Energy Consumers Australia, like our forums. One example you brought up there, which I thought was really interesting, is about the idea of the Nissan Leaf having the ability to be a mobile battery. You know, is there some creative ways in which that sort of technology could be used to meet some of the challenges that you've mentioned?
Absolutely. I think it's a way off. Thanks for the reminder. It's probably 5 years away technically in Australia from being a realistic solution, and maybe 10 years before it's widespread. But I think most electric vehicles will start to have that capability because it makes sense from a consumer point of view. You can feed energy back into the grid when demand is high, you will get a good price for it. And if you're a network, you might say offer EV owners a significant premium on the supply of the energy that they can provide to the grid if it's accessible to the network in a time of need, like when there's an outage. So even if it's something like backing up at an emergency evacuation centre, and they offer $10 a kilowatt hour instead of 10 cents or whatever. There will be some kind of financial incentive, but there may be also altruistic ways of doing that. So people will be encouraged to help their neighbours and their communities by offering their power if they don't need it to drive around during a bushfire, which most people don't, except to escape.
Okay. So as you would expect, this work is kind of available online far and wide in a whole bunch of different places. So we'll drop the links to that information just below this video so people can go check it out. Mark, thanks so much for having a chat today.
Thanks very much, Phil.